Joining me now from San Antonio is former Housing Secretary and Democratic presidential candidate, former Mayor of San Antonio, by the way, Julian Castro. Secretary Castro, welcome back to Meet the Press, sir.
Good to be with you, Chuck.
Before I get to politics, the campaign, I want to talk about what happened in your home state there in Odessa and Midland. This is now the second mass shooting just in Texas this month. It's been quite a bit just in the last couple of years. Let me ask you this. If you're president right now, Congress is coming back. What does your response look like?
If I were president right now, I would do two things. First of all, I would maximize executive authority to do what we can to keep our families safer from gun violence. For instance, we would immediately redefine who is a firearms dealer so that anybody who sells more than five firearms in a year is classified that way and has to conduct universal background checks. We would also push legislation in Congress to get common sense gun safety legislation done and, put as much pressure on these swing state Republican senators who are up for re-election in 2020 to get them to go with something that we can compromise on, at least universal background checks. I think that we can do more than that in the future. But this kind of inaction and, the talk that we heard today from I think that was Senator Rick Scott. Right. It's the same old thing. It's happy talk and this promise that we're going to do something. We're going to look at it, but they never actually do it. Right. And you were talking about gaffes and lies. I mean, the biggest lies that the president has told include that he would do something about universal background checks. He said that twice, after Parkland and then after El Paso and Dayton, and he's gone back on his word. Those are the biggest things that count for this president.
As a Texan, how do you change the conversation about the culture of guns? Meaning, as you know quite a few probably friends in Texas who they hear all this and they say, yeah, but it's going to turn into gun confiscation, or it's going to turn into me not being able to have the gun that I want. How do you impact the culture on this?
Well, look, you're from Florida. There are a lot of folks watching out there from states where a lot of folks go hunting, they go sporting. But oftentimes it's actually hunters and folks that shoot on a range that understand that you don't need these weapons of war, this AR-15 and other similar weapons. I think more and more, many of them get it. Sure, I agree that there are a certain percentage of people that somehow fear that one day the government is going to try and take over the entire country somehow, and they're going to need their weapons. But that's actually a minority of people out there. That's not a majority of people. And the most poignant moment over the last several weeks happened right after Dayton, which was when Governor Mike DeWine got up there to talk about what had happened, and the crowd of Republicans, Democrats, people from different political stripes started to chant, "Do something, do something, do something." More and more people here in Texas and across the country want Congress and their politicians to do something.
By the way, when you were outlining what you would do now, do you feel as if you have to bring the country together on this, meaning you do as much as you can get done without making it politically divisive, or do you push the envelope a bit?
Well, look, I mean, we know that it's already politically divisive. There's no way to get around that. But I do think that when you're in public office, that you have an obligation to make the case. You have to be honest with your constituents, with the American people. And the thing is, on this issue of common sense gun safety legislation, people know the arguments. They know where people stand. This is not a new argument. I was thinking about yesterday evening Texas and how much gun violence we've had. But you think back to 1966 and Charles Whitman at that UT Tower, and when that happened, what a shock to the system that was. And people have been talking about these things for a long, long time. And so I think we need to get universal background checks done, a renewed assault weapons ban, and limiting the capacity of these magazines, at least that.
Let me turn now to the presidential race. Simple question. Are you surprised that the Democratic Party of today, that the three front runners right now are all over the age of 70?
I don't know if surprised is the right word. First of all, the folks that you're talking about are very talented individuals with tremendous experience. But what I hear out there and what I think is going to show itself as we get closer and closer to the Iowa caucus is that people do want a new generation of leadership. And, for Democrats that are out there, what I hear is a lot of anxiety about, hey, we need to beat Donald Trump. How are we going to beat Donald Trump? Well, if you take a look at the modern era of presidential campaigns, when Democrats have won, it's because they've taken a bit of a risk, whether it was Kennedy in 1960 or Carter in 1976 or Barack Obama in 2008. And we need to get people off the sidelines in 2020. I believe that I can reassemble the Obama coalition and then supercharge that so that we can go back and win Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, and then also get the 29 electoral votes of Florida, the 11 electoral votes of Arizona, and I believe even the 38 electoral votes of Texas. And I'll just say, Chuck, that the other day I was in Iowa and I met a young woman who said that she was going to turn 18 before the Iowa caucus, and she said, I'm excited to get registered to vote and to go and caucus for you. Those are the kinds of things that I'm hearing out there among young people. If we're going to win this election, we're going to have to get young people involved and get people off the sidelines.
If Joe Biden's the nominee, do you have any concerns?
Well, I think that Joe Biden would be a much better president, of course, than Donald Trump. If I didn't think that I would be a better president, I wouldn't be running this race. But I think that he would be a much better president than Donald Trump. I also believe that just on issues, Joe Biden and I have some different disagreements. We talked about our disagreement on immigration on the stage at the last debate. I also believe that he hasn't gone far enough on health care. We need to base our health care off of a Medicare system and then allow for a private option. So we have real disagreements, but I won't argue with folks that say that any of the Democrats that are running or that will be on the stage in Houston in a few days would be better than Donald Trump.
Secretary Castro, I got to leave it there. It's been one of those weekends, busy weekend. Thanks for coming on and sharing your views. Be safe in the trail, and we'll see you at that debate.
Good to be with you, Chuck.
Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and then click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.